The notice had said, "Widower seeks capable woman. Hardin Creek, Montana. Permanent arrangement. Apply in writing." It had not said anything else. It had not asked her age, her history, or her measurements. That last part was the reason Mabel Sutton had written back. She folded her hands in her lap the entire way up the mountain pass and did not let herself think about what she would find at the other end of it. If you already feel something for this woman, if you already want her to be safe, please subscribe to this channel and stay with me until the end. Drop the name of your city or town in the comments right now. I want to see how far this story travels tonight, because what happens next in Hardin Creek, Montana in the winter of 1883 is going to stay with you for a long, long time. She had been traveling for 9 days. 3 trains east to west, 2 stagecoaches north, and the last 14 miles in a borrowed wagon, driven by a man named Dietz, who had not looked directly at her since Billings. He had taken her trunk without comment, loaded it without help, and then spent the better part of an hour finding reasons to busy himself near the harness until she climbed up herself. It was December. The sky over the Bitterroot Range was the specific color of an old bruise. "Silas Cray," Dietz said finally, when the wagon was moving and there was no longer any graceful way to be silent. "You know him?" "I read his notice," Mabel said. "He don't talk much. Don't talk at all some days." Dietz pulled his collar up against the wind. Lost his wife 2 winters past. Fever. The girl was 7 at the time. Boy was 4. He kept them alive, I'll give him that. But the house has gone to ruin something terrible. Had a woman from Billings come out last spring. She lasted 11 days and walked back to town carrying her own trunk. He paused. Other one before that lasted 3. "I am not from Billings," Mabel said. He glanced at her then, the first time since Billings, and she met his eyes without expression. He looked away. She had learned a long time ago that meeting a person's eyes when they expected you to drop yours was its own form of language, and she had become fluent in it. She had grown up the largest girl in Millhaven, Indiana, and then she had grown up some more. And then she had married Gerald Sutton, who was a kind man. And then she had buried him of a heart complaint in September, with $31 to her name, and no family within 500 miles. The $31 had become 22 by the time she answered the notice. The 22 had become 9 by the time she reached Billings. She had not eaten since yesterday's noon meal, but she had learned to keep that sort of information private. The wagon came down off the ridge road into what the map called Hardin Creek, though creek was generous. It was more of a frozen suggestion running behind a row of gray buildings, a general store, a church with a crooked steeple, and a feed yard. Dietz pulled up in front of the store to water the horse, and she climbed down without being offered a hand. She felt them looking. She always felt them looking. It moved across her the way cold water moves, a long, traveling sensation that started at the top and worked its way down, methodical and unhurried, the way you'd measure a yard of cloth to see whether there was enough. She picked up her smaller bag and started toward the store. Well, a woman's voice from the porch. Not lowered. Not even trying to be lowered. "I wonder what Silas Cray is thinking." "Poor man," said another voice. And then there was laughter. Mabel did not stop walking. She had not stopped walking in 41 years, and she did not intend to start now. She had learned that stopping gave them the satisfaction of watching you decide what to do about it. And she had no time for that. She went into the store and bought a tin of coffee and a square of hard cheese with 4 of her remaining $9, and came back out without looking at anyone on the porch. Dietz had the horse watered. He loaded her back into the wagon without speaking, and they drove the last 2 miles in silence. The Cray property sat at the base of a long slope, backed against a stand of lodgepole pine that must have been beautiful in another season. What it was now was exhausted. The fence line ran in 3 directions and gave up in the 4th. The barn had a door hanging at an angle that suggested it had been trying to fall off for some time and had simply never quite committed. The house itself, a low-roofed structure with a wide porch, had paint on perhaps half its boards, the other half having apparently decided that exposure was easier. A stovepipe leaned from the east wall at an angle of cheerful uncertainty, but there was smoke coming from it. And there were 2 small faces in the window, watching the wagon come down the road. And when the front door opened, the man standing in it was looking at her with the expression of a person who has been given a problem he did not expect and is working out its dimensions before he speaks. He was not as old as she had anticipated, perhaps 38, perhaps a year or 2 more. Tall, with the particular build of a man who has spent many years carrying things. His jaw was set and his hands were at his sides, and there were deep lines around his eyes that had not come from smiling. "You're the woman from Indiana," he said. "Mabel Sutton," she said. Yes, he looked at her the way Dietz had at first, that long measuring pause, and she waited, because she had learned how to wait. "The notice said capable woman," he said finally. "I read it." She lifted her smaller bag. "I am a capable woman. I have cooked for crews of 15, kept books for a hardware concern, set bones, 2 of them successfully, and I have not been ill a single day in 11 years. I do not require much, and I do not cause trouble." She paused. "I should tell you something, though, before we proceed." He waited. "No one will marry me," she said. It came out even, because she said it even. "I have been told this my whole life, and I have no reason to disbelieve it. I am not a small woman, and I am not a pretty one, and I understand that this arrangement was described as permanent, which I take to mean marriage. And I want to be honest with you about what you are looking at before you decide." She let a moment go by. "But I can cook, Mr. Cray. Whatever else I am not, I can cook." Silas Cray looked at her for the length of time it takes a candle to burn down a 1/4 inch. "Who told you no one would marry you?" he said. It was not quite a question. "Everyone," she said. "Everyone," he repeated. He said it as though he were testing the word's weight and finding it insufficient. Then he pushed the door open wider and stepped back. "Kitchen's on the left. It's a mess." That was all. But something in the way he said everyone, flat and unimpressed, as though he found the entire consensus badly reasoned, settled somewhere behind her ribs and stayed there. She went in. The kitchen was on the left. He had not been wrong about the mess. The stove was crusted with the remnants of a dozen scorched attempts at meals, the residue of a man learning to cook out of necessity and learning poorly. The basin had standing water in it that smelled of iron and neglect. 4 mice had been at the flour barrel with great enthusiasm and little discretion. A pot that might have once held soup sat on the counter with something inside it that had made its peace with being there permanently. Mabel set her bag on the cleanest available surface, which was the windowsill, and looked at the room for a long moment. She was not appalled. She had seen worse. She was simply calculating. She rolled up her sleeves and began. The children appeared in the doorway while she was scrubbing the stove. The girl first, Pearl, she would learn, 9 years old, with her father's jaw, and a careful, watchful quality that suggested she had learned to read rooms the way other children learned to read words. The boy was Thomas, 6, with a round face and a gap where his left front tooth had recently been. Pearl said nothing. Thomas said, "Are you going to live here?" "That depends on your father," Mabel said without stopping her work. He said probably, Thomas said. Pearl said, he said possibly, in a correcting tone, and went away. Thomas stayed. He watched her dismantle the stovepipe with the specific fascination children bring to competence they have not previously witnessed, and by the time Silas appeared in the doorway, carrying an armload of wood that he set beside the stove without being asked, Mabel had the firebox cleaned out and the surface scraped to something that would conduct heat properly. He looked at what she had done. He set the wood down. "Supper," he said, not a request. A statement of the hour. "1 hour," she said. He left. Thomas stayed another 10 minutes, and then Pearl came back and collected him with the efficiency of a girl who had been mothering for 2 years without anyone giving her the job title. And Mabel was alone in the kitchen with a clean stove and the last of her $9 in her coat pocket, and a very specific plan for what she was going to do first. What she did first was make bread. Not because bread was quick, it was not. Proper bread was never quick. But because bread going into a cold house was a declaration. She had a sourdough starter in the small tin in her bag, kept alive through 9 days of travel with the focused attention other women gave to more portable things. She fed it first. Then, she found what the pantry had to offer, which was not much but was enough. Dried beans, a heel of salt pork, 2 onions that had seen better days, a turnip that had not, a half bag of cornmeal, and a crock of lard. She made bean soup with the salt pork and put it on. She made corn dodgers in the skillet. She put the bread to rise near the newly warmed stove and let the smell of it begin its work, which was the real work. Smell was the first thing and the most honest thing, the thing that got into a person before they had a chance to decide what they thought about it. By the time Silas came back in from the barn, the kitchen smelled like a different building. He stopped in the doorway. She did not make anything of it. She ladled soup into 3 bowls and put them on the table and called for the children and sat down herself. Pearl ate with the contained, deliberate manner of a girl who did not want to seem hungry. Thomas did not bother with containment. He ate the way 6-year-old boys have always eaten, urgently, without coming up for air. Silas ate 2 bowls of soup and 4 corn dodgers and did not say a word about any of it. But he sat at the table after the children had gone, longer than he needed to, and Mabel refilled his coffee without asking, and he accepted it without comment. And that was a conversation of a kind. She cleared the dishes. He went back out to the barn to do the last of the evening chores. The bread came out at 9 o'clock, a good solid loaf with a dark crust and a crumb that held its shape when she pressed it, and she left it on the counter for morning, because it was better the next day, and she intended to be there for the next day. She went to the room he had indicated, a small one off the main hall, with a clean quilt that Pearl had clearly put there, and she sat on the edge of the bed in the dark and let herself feel, for exactly the duration of 3 long breaths, how tired she was. Then she lay down and she slept without dreaming. 3 weeks passed. She settled into the house the way water settles into a low place, by finding where things wanted to go and going there. She was not hired to do the mending, but she did it. She was not hired to sit with Thomas when he had a cough that kept him up at night, but she sat with him, and she noticed that the cough was not in his chest, but in his sinuses, and she made a steam with pine oil and dried thyme that had him sleeping by midnight. She was not hired to tell Pearl that the accounts book her father thought was balanced was $6 short due to a simple addition error, but she found it and fixed it, and left it on the desk without remarking on it. Silas noticed. She could tell because he did not say anything about it, and he was a man who said nothing about many things. But the quality of his silence about these particular things was different. It was the silence of a person who has noticed something and is not ready to say what it means yet. He put extra firewood outside her door one morning, without being asked. He fixed the hinge on the kitchen cupboard that she had been working around without complaint. He took the heaviest water buckets himself on mornings, when the ice in the yard was thick and treacherous. He did not comment on these things. She did not comment on them. The children noticed, the way children notice everything that adults have decided not to talk about. Pearl was the one who came to her. It was a Sunday afternoon, gray and cold, the kind of afternoon that had no ambitions. Mabel was at the kitchen table with a small project in flour and butter that was going to become a pie. Though it was still in the stage of becoming. Pearl came in and sat across from her without asking, and watched for a long while without speaking. Then she said, "My mother made pie." "What kind?" Mabel asked. "Apple, but the kind with the lattice top." Pearl was quiet. "She made it at Christmas." "Lattice is harder than it looks," Mabel said, "but I can show you if you want to learn." Pearl considered this with the gravity of a treaty negotiation. Then she got up and went to wash her hands at the basin, and she came back and sat close, and Mabel showed her how the strips went over and under without breaking, and Pearl's first attempt collapsed, and her second was imperfect, and her third held together with stubborn determination. And by the time Silas came in from checking the fence line, his daughter was pressing the edge of a lattice-top pie with a fork. And the look that crossed his face when he saw it lasted only a second before he put it away again. But Mabel saw it. She learned things about him that she had not been told. She found the locked room by accident, or by the nature of houses, which is that they disclose themselves eventually to anyone who lives in them with attention. It was the small room at the end of the upper hall with the key always in the lock, and the door never opened. She had assumed it was storage. It was not storage. The key was in the lock, and she did not turn it. She stood in the hall and looked at the key and put it together with the way the grief sat on him. Not like a wound, which would have been dramatic, but like a piece of gear he had put on 2 winters ago and had not yet figured out how to take off. His wife had been in that room. Whatever she had left behind was in that room. He kept the key in the lock because forgetting where it was would have been worse. Mabel walked back downstairs and said nothing about it to anyone. The trouble came in the second week of January. His name was Aldous Croft, and he arrived from Billings on a Tuesday with a leather satchel and a deed and the particular expression of a man who has been told to deliver bad news and has decided to enjoy the delivery. He was the agent for a land concern that had purchased Silas's debt. The mortgage on the north 20 acres, which Silas had taken out the year his wife was sick to pay for the doctor who had come and gone and done nothing useful. The terms had come due. The land concern wanted payment in full by the 28th of the month, 17 days, or the north 20 would revert to the concern, which would put the water access on the east side of the property out of reach and make the ranch non-viable. Silas sat at the table with the papers and said nothing for a long time. Thomas was asleep. Pearl was at the table doing her lessons with great concentration, which meant she was listening to every word. Mabel poured coffee for Croft. Not because she wanted to, but because she was a practical woman, and she stood at the stove and listened to Croft explain the situation with a satisfaction that he was not quite bothering to conceal. The sum owed was $460. Silas did not have $460. He had perhaps 90, and the spring cattle hadn't moved yet. When Croft left, the house was very quiet. Pearl closed her arithmetic book and looked at her father. Thomas slept. The stovepipe ticked as the metal expanded. Silas got up and went out to the barn. Mabel waited an hour. Then she put on her coat and her good boots, the ones she had been saving the leather on, and went after him. He was at the far end of the barn, sitting on an overturned bucket in the dark, and he did not look up when she came in. She found a milk crate and sat on it 6 feet away from him and did not say anything for 40 seconds. "My wife died in that north field," he said finally, not looking at her. His voice was the voice of a man who has been carrying something in his chest for 2 years and has just now, by accident, set it down. "She went out in the fever to check on the stock. Wouldn't let me do it, said I had the baby to mind." He stopped. "Found her in the morning when the fever broke and I could stand up. 20 yards from the fence line." He was quiet a long time. I don't know what I'm doing without her. I never did know, and I always thought I had more time to figure it out." He had not said this to anyone. Mabel could tell because it came out in the broken rhythm of something that had been held in one position too long. She did not tell him it would be all right. She did not tell him his wife would want him to be happy, or that time healed, or any of the other things people said when they did not know what else to offer. She sat on the milk crate in the cold barn, and she was present, which was its own form of language, and she stayed until he ran out of things he hadn't meant to say. Then she said, "I have $9. He looked at her then. "It won't solve 460, she said, "but I have it, and I want you to know it exists. And I want you to let me look at the cattle numbers in the morning, because something Dietz said when he drove me out doesn't add up with what I've seen, and I think you may have more coming in spring than you know." He was quiet. "Also," she said, "I know you didn't hire me to do this. But I'm here and the problem is here, and I'm not going to sit in the kitchen and pretend otherwise." He looked at her for a long time. Then he said, "Why?" "Because I can," she said, "and because it needs doing." He did not say anything else, but he went back to the house with her. And that was something. The next morning she went through the accounts with the methodical attention she had once given to the hardware concern in Millhaven. And she found what she'd suspected from Dietz's offhand remark about the spring count. Silas had sold 2 seasons ago at the price his neighbor had recommended, and that price had been a third under market. The neighbor had bought the remaining head himself. Quietly, the cattle coming to market in spring, at accurate value, would clear enough to satisfy the note and leave a margin. She put the numbers on paper. She showed them to Silas over the kitchen table while Pearl ate her oatmeal and watched them both with the careful attention of a girl who understood that what was happening at that table mattered. He looked at the numbers for a long time. "Dietz's neighbor," he said. "If you can prove the original transaction," she said. "He advised you to sell low and then bought the surplus himself. That's fraud, Mr. Cray, and there are 2 witnesses who were at that sale, and their names are at the bottom of that sheet." He looked at the sheet. He looked at her. "How do you know any of this?" he said. "I kept books for 7 years, she said. And I listened to Dietz." What followed were 9 days of the particular urgency that attaches itself to a deadline when you have just discovered there may be a way through it. Letters to Billings. A conversation, uncomfortable and direct, between Silas and the cattle buyer who had been at the original sale. A visit from the county land agent, who arrived to find that the matter was not as simple as Croft had presented it. Croft came back once more with a revised expression and left with less than he had expected. On the 26th of January, 2 days before the note came due, Silas Cray walked into Hardin Creek's general store, which also served as the nearest thing the town had to a courthouse for matters of this size, and he did something that Mabel did not know he was going to do. Aldous Croft was there. The land agent was there. The feed store owner, the blacksmith, and 4 other men whose names she had learned in the past 3 weeks were there. The woman from the church who had been on the general store porch when Mabel arrived was there, which Mabel noticed. Silas laid the documentation on the counter. He explained, in as few words as possible, the nature of the fraudulent sale, the witnesses, and the amount by which the spring cattle would clear the note. The county land agent read the papers. Croft started to speak. Silas looked at him, and Croft stopped. Then Silas said, "This woman found it." He did not gesture. He did not need to. There was only one woman in the room. "She's been here 6 weeks," he said. "She came out in December with $9 and a sourdough starter, and my house has been fed, and my children have been looked after, and this ranch is going to stand because she sat down with my books and found what someone thought to hide in them." He paused. "I want that noted." He said it the way a man says the only thing that needs to be said. The land agent noted it. The blacksmith, who had known Silas Cray for 11 years, looked at Mabel with a different kind of attention than the porch attention, the kind that lands differently. The woman from the church porch did not say anything. Several people said nothing in the specific way that is not silence, but acknowledgement. Croft left with a great deal less than he had come for. On the walk back to the wagon, Silas's wagon, the wagon she had been arriving in and departing in for 6 weeks now, he fell into step beside her, and they walked without speaking until they were past the last building. Then he said, "You asked me something. When you first came." She waited. "You said no one would marry you." He was looking straight ahead, "And I've been thinking about it, and I want to say something about that." "You don't have to," she said. "I want to," he said. She waited again. "Everyone was wrong," he said, simply, without decoration, the way a man states a fact that he finds the previous consensus on to be poorly reasoned and not worth preserving. "That's all. They were wrong." Mabel Sutton looked at the mountain behind the town, which was what it had always been, large and cold and going about its business without consulting anyone. "All right," she said. He helped her up into the wagon. It was the first time he had offered, and she had a feeling it would not be the last. They were married in March, in the church with the crooked steeple, on a day when the snow was melting off the lodge poles in long silver streams, and the air smelled like pine and cold water, and the possibility of a different season. Pearl wore her good dress and held Mabel's arm at the door and walked in beside her. Thomas lost a second tooth during the ceremony and interrupted it briefly to show everyone. The land agent attended. The blacksmith attended. The woman from the general store porch attended and shook Mabel's hand at the end without quite meeting her eyes, which was its own form of apology, and Mabel accepted it without comment, because she had long since learned the difference between the things worth carrying and the things you set down. The sourdough starter lived in a crock on the kitchen shelf, and Mabel fed it every morning, and every morning the house filled with the particular smell of bread beginning its rise, which is a warm, yeasty, slightly sour smell that means someone has been paying attention and will continue to pay attention, and the day is going to be fed. 17 years later, Pearl Cray would describe her stepmother to her own daughter as the woman who saved the ranch and taught her to make a proper lattice crust, in that order, and meant both things as the highest possible compliment. Silas Cray did not become a man of many words. But there was one thing he said regularly, without being asked, for the rest of his life, whenever anyone made the mistake of implying that Mabel was more than he might have expected, or more than the situation warranted, or more than someone like her had any right to be. He said, "Everyone was wrong." And then he said nothing else, because the statement was complete, and he had always been a man who understood when a thing was complete. Mabel Sutton Cray took up every inch of the life she had built, with both hands, without apology, the way she had always known she would if someone would simply move out of the road and let her at it. She had been enough from the beginning. She was simply home now.